Oh, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of Quzara, Schellman and Carahsoft, I would like to welcome you to our webinar, Navigating FedRAMP, Understanding Recent Changes and Preparing for the Future. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. AJ Malik, Director of Compliance Advisory, Quzara. Doug Stonier, FedRAMP Manager at Schellman. AJ and Doug, I will hand over the floor to you at this time.
Morning, everybody. Afternoon, everybody. My name is AJ Malik. I'm the Director of Advisory here at Quzara. As a quick intro, we are a woman-owned cybersecurity firm based in the Washington, D.C. area. We are a woman-owned and minority-owned business. We are a SBA, Small Business Administration's 8A, and Minority Business Enterprise MBE certified cybersecurity firm. We have access to GSA multiple award schedules, and we are approved on all the HACCP categories. As a general piece about us, we are an advisory firm that addresses all compliance and security requirements across all major frameworks. We focus especially though in the FedRAMP space, as the federal sector is very important to us and very important in the overarching security policies across the board. I'm gonna do a quick intro and then hand it over to Doug, so I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome, thanks. Again, I am Doug Stonier. I am a federal manager here at Schellman. Besides being the #1 3PAO in the FedRAMP marketplace, we are also one of the pioneering CMMC authorized C3PAO. And to just highlight a few industries outside of the federal space, Schellman is a globally licensed assessor who performs PCI, ISO, and high trust assessments, just to name a few. You can see on this slide that there are other multiple areas of services that we perform. But just as an overall summary for Schellman, our team's expertise and collaborative mentality really helps a company consolidate their cybersecurity assessments to reduce audit fatigue and turn this into a strategic advantage. So when you're doing business with Schellman, we look at it from all different assessments. That's my little soapbox on Schellman. Stepping to the next one here. So you're all here regarding FedRAMP Rev 5. It's the newest thing on the block, but just to wind back the clock a bit here, we'll just give a brief overview of where FedRAMP came from, right? So since 2011, FedRAMP has become a vital role in helping the US government understand how to utilize the cloud environment and make sure that it's secure for federal data, right? So the underlying framework for FedRAMP was the NIST 853. At the beginning, it was, I think it was a revision 3 at the very, very beginning of 2011. So as the NIST, the NIST Special Public 853 matured, so did the FedRAMP programs. And most recently, we are now on revision 5. And with that, following the publication of the 2023 release of the FedRAMP Rev 5, this has brought a lot of questions and uncertainty based on the updated controls and the impact of the addition of the privacy requirements now integrated into the security control baseline. Fortunately, with the expertise that's provided by Quzara and also Schellman, from a 3PAO perspective, in coordination with Carahsoft, we can dive deeper into the major impacts of this new Rev 5 and also provide a little bit, maybe hopefully some clarity in some of the controls that we'll cover lately.
Perfect, thanks for that, Doug. So we always kind of think back to D-Day sometime late in March of 2023 when an email came out that said, hey, Rev 5 is out and ready to go. A lot of people panicked. A lot of people had a lot of information kind of to process. So I think between ourselves, all the advisory firms and Schellman especially, we did a lot of analysis on the control baselines that were provided by the PMO. What we had kind of wanted to do is break that out into some kind of major high level overviews. As we know in FedRAMP Moderate Revision 4, there were 325 controls across 17 control families. As we sit now with revision 5, there are 18 control families and a total of 323 controls. Now, the question that always gets asked is, we have less controls, but more control families. What does that mean? So we've broken this out into kind of 5 different categories of the controls that are in scope for Rev 5. Number 1 is controls that did not change. Basically a direct holdover from a revision 4 control to a revision 5 control. The second grouping was brand new or net new controls, controls that people had not seen before in the moderate baseline, including a new full control family. The third major category for us was those that had parameter changes, where something had to be done at a more frequent cadence. There are different alerting requirements. There are different reporting requirements. Just having some sort of process, technical, or update that's needed. The next group was a just moderate control enhancement, where the language may have been changed. The inclusion of privacy for various things. Training now including privacy requirements. Training may also include other pieces. So there's a lot of minor tweaks that we go in, and that's kind of the biggest chunk for us. And then the last control that we call out, the grouping we call out, is the major control changes. These are control changes that we've identified that have the highest level of effort, the ones that cannot be done with a simple process change, something that's not an easy level of effort, and something that may have an associated cost that we may not have planned for, but we'll have to adjust for as a part of the revision 5 transition. What we've also done is done that same breakout for revision 5. So in the past, we know where we were revision 4. With revision 5, we're now at a control baseline of 410 controls. And we've again broken this out for each one of the major sections. So again, net new controls at the Rev 5 high baseline, parameter changes, controls that have not been changed, and then the moderate changes on top of what we've already seen on the Rev 4 side. As a part of this presentation, you guys will get a copy of this presentation. And what we've done is a control matrix, kind of a color coordination of which controls have changed, which controls have not changed, and which ones have a parameter change, which ones are net new. All those various requirements you'll see by the actual key code at the bottom. We've also done a similar exercise for revision 4 from a FedRAMP moderate to a FedRAMP high. So you'll see from that change of a revision 4 and revision 5 is one big change, but going from a moderate to high on revision 5 is another massive change. So again, using this as a kind of easy color coordination to say, hey, these are the controls we know we have to address from a various requirement perspective or a various uplift perspective. Now, the one thing everyone talks about is, yeah, we've got a bunch of new controls, a bunch of new parameters. What do we have to do? How do we address those? So the purpose of this kind of webinar today is going to be walking through some of those major changes. We want to cover this from both aspects and both sides. On the Quzara side, we'll cover this from an advisory practice, saying, hey, what do you think you need to implement? What do these controls mean? What does the spirit of the control mean? How do we get this implemented, and how do we get ready for an audit? Then Doug on the Schellman side will walk us through kind of what an auditor looks for in an audit. When you get into that formal kind of 3-month engagement, do an engagement, what do they look for? What are general recommendations that they can provide that say, hey, if you're implementing these things, here's what we expect to see, or what the PMO has provided us guidance on what we need to see. Jumping in, I think I can go ahead and hand this over to Doug, if you want to take some hit on the overview.
Yes, absolutely. You can go ahead and hop on to the next one here. So like AJ was showing in his breakdown, there were roughly 21 controls that were added to like the moderate baseline. There were just a smaller amount added to the higher baseline, right? The impact of that is everyone's trying to figure out what to focus in on during this, first transition phase. Obviously, you want to address all the controls, but the ones that we saw from a 3PO perspective and which ones we're getting a lot more questions about are broken down here on this slide. So while it may not contain all of the net new controls, really wanted to focus down in these 5 areas from a FedRAMP perspective. So first of all, the SR family. It's a brand new control family that's being added to the baselines, right? This was previously there was a supply chain protection control in SA12, but that was only at the high baseline. And it didn't encompass everything that the new SR control family has. So we'll go into a little bit more detail later as what we from a 3PO perspective are looking for. AT23, this is in addition to requiring literacy training on social engineering and social mining be provided at least annually. Before, it was just a security awareness training overall for AT2 and insider threat. So they've added another aspect that they want us as a 3PO to validate that you're teaching your employees what to look for regarding social engineering and potential social mining. For IR6 enhancement 3, this is a coordination with the SR control family. With that new introduction, we really want to focus on the supply chain aspect of things in this area. And again, while this wasn't a new control, this was added to the FedRAMP baselines. The next one, RA511, I've had a lot of questions from clients asking about this one, but this is now requiring that a reporting channel is available to the public to notify a CSP of vulnerabilities. So it's creating like an open door policy between CSPs and their customers, or even just people that are doing types of ethical hacking out there that are identifying vulnerabilities and presenting them to a company to fix. And we'll also go into that one in a little bit more detail. And then the final one here is the SI4 enhancement 18. This was analyzing traffic for covert exfiltration. This one is a little bit more in depth, and I don't have a slide directly related to this one, but from a high level overview, from a 3PO perspective, we're looking for any type of tooling that you have now implemented in the boundary to look for covert exfiltration of information. The first thing that comes to mind is steganography, the ability to insert data within another data file to exfiltrate it from the environment without having to use encryption or other means. So just masking what someone is taking out of the system. So at the top of my head and what I've discussed with my other colleagues is really we're looking for like a DLP tool in this kind of area. And I know AJ, I know from an advisory perspective, I don't know if there's been any other communications on that part, but from our perspective, that is the main way to cover this SI4 enhancement 18 control. The other ways there may be some monitoring perspectives you can use to identify certain file structure, file length, suspicious activity that way. But at the end of the day, the true tool that can perform this is going to be a DLP tool, which may be a huge impact to a lot of clients. We can move to the next one there. And then these are controls that have been in place already from the Rev 4 baseline, but there were updates to the parameters that were deemed significant enough for impacting not only the way we're going to test, but also how a CSP is going to meet their compliance needs. The first one here is CA7. Any CSP that's on the agency path now with more than one agency should be conducting joint monthly ConMon meetings with all agencies involved. And we'll dive in a little bit more about what we're expecting from a 3PO perspective. But at the overall top, it's just going to be making sure that there's some sort of invite out there to all agencies who are involved with your system, so that they have the ability to be aware of any changes you're making or any identified vulnerabilities. The next one here for these 4 controls, these are all encryption, right? It's just, again, re-emphasizing the requirement that encryption of all data at rest and data in transit using FIPS 140-2 validated or NSA approved cryptography. This isn't a new requirement. It's been present before, but there's just more emphasis on identifying the data in transit areas, especially when you get down into the in between systems, not just traffic coming in from the customer, but also internal traffic. The big one here, CM6, I think this has been the biggest heartache for everyone, and also the biggest change from our perspective is no longer is CIS level 1 benchmarks sufficient. The PMO and the federal agencies involved with making the adjustments to the Rev 4 to Rev 5 baseline have now required that DISA STIGs be the mandatory #1 benchmark. And if you cannot use a STIG, to then look at CIS level 2 benchmarks. This is a significant uplift from the CIS level 1 profile. And there's just a little blurb here regarding the difference between level 1 and level 2. But regardless, I think the big takeaway here is implementing DISA STIGs throughout the system. And the final one here, SE7B, it's just, this was in the subnet white paper, but now they've put it into the actual parameters and FedRAMP guidance that you can find. But there is the requirement that there is subnet isolation for the public and private system components. This was produced late last year as a white paper, but now it's enforced at the Rev 5 level. Okay, so from a 3PO perspective of reviewing the FAQs and being involved in a lot of the discussions with the PMO, the first thing that I want everyone to take away from this is that expect this guidance to adjust as Rev 5 matures, right? Not everything was set in stone when Rev 4 came out back in 2014, 2015. It took several years, over 5 years really, to get to a place where the PMO had confidence in what was being presented for Rev 4 and what they wanted as a standard assessment at moderate and high baseline. So know that while these controls are in place today, the requirements and parameters may be adjusted throughout the maturity of Rev 5. So what I say today may become completely obsolete when PMO decides to publish a new white paper or something like that. So I just wanted to make sure that is perfectly clear to everyone on the call. But from that perspective, here are some key takeaways that we have identified. The first one is that there's going to be more scrutiny in the alignment between your system diagrams and the SSP attachments. So I put a little parentheses here for Appendix M and Appendix Q. Appendix M is the system inventory. In that inventory list now, they have a diagram label column that is mandatory. So that is requiring that you can take a label from your diagram and associate it with everything that's listed in your inventory. The meaning behind this is to really just make sure that there's full awareness of what is in your diagram versus what you have in your inventory. And then hopefully this will help identify any areas that aren't being listed in your diagrams and help create a more full and mature diagram model. The other thing is Appendix Q. And then this is where the PMO is requiring that everyone list out all system cryptography that is being used for the data in transit and data at rest. And then this will directly align with your data flow diagrams, where they have the requirement that all traffic through your diagrams is labeled as either FIPS, not in FIPS, or unencrypted, right? So there should be a correlation between what you have listed in your Appendix Q versus what you see in your diagrams. And so when we come in as a 3PO, we are going to be looking to verify that what you have placed in your Appendix M and your Appendix Q align with your diagram. So it's another level of going above and beyond what we used to do, which is just make sure that the diagrams met the maturity authorization boundary guidance. Now there's a couple of extra steps along the way. The next one here is that there's going to be more time invested from our perspective in the review and analyzation of configuration benchmarks. And there will be an impact to finding counts as well. And we'll get into that on the next slide here. But the third bullet here, inclusion of privacy into the baseline controls. So prior to Rev 5, in the Rev 4 baseline of NIST 853, there were the security controls, and then there were privacy controls. And 9 times out of 10, this did not impact anyone that was using going through the FedRAMP perspective, because we were only focused on the security control baselines. With Rev 5, now our questionings will ask your teams, ask your SMEs, like, okay, this control does have a privacy addition to it. Is there any impact to, do you handle PII or PHI? Is your team aware of the practices if PII is present? Those kind of things are going to be asked. So just be aware that the interviews and line of questioning from your 3PAO may change to include privacy. So don't be surprised if you start seeing those questions come during interviews. And then the final thing here is just document, right? We can't validate what we can't review. So as you guys go through transition for Rev 5, it's important that you're documenting how you're meeting controls along the way, right? The worst thing that can happen is we get into an interview where we're having a great conversation. We ask to see how you guys are implementing something, and it just falls. It's like, oh, we didn't know we had to have something. So that's just the maybe common sense one, but I always like to emphasize that whenever I have a chance to talk to the public about evidence collection. Okay, going into the next one here. So the next couple slides here are going to be around what is the ideal scenario for us as a 3PAO trying to review and get a positive control implementation, right? For CM6, the first thing I'd like to discuss is the FedRAMP guidance. Okay, with DISA-STIGs, originally what we would do is, we will review your system benchmarks, review your justifications, do the net delta, validate that everything is good, and if there was any issues, that would be one CM6 finding. Now, with the new guidance here, we are required that wherever there's a direct mapping between failed benchmarks and NIST 853, we need to report those as additional findings per control. So what I mean by this is I wrote down an example from a STIG. In the Windows 2022 server STIG, there is a STIG check, and you can look this up yourself. It's V254282. It has a direct tie to SC28 Enhancement 1. So it's about encryption at rest on your Windows servers. Now, during our normal Rev 4, we would just validate that you have data at rest encryption in the place where data exists. But now that this is going to look at every single component within your boundary, this may be a failed check. And if that is true and there is no justification for that failed check, we must call that out now as an SC28-1 finding. From our perspective, our way of interpreting this would be to also include in there that the failed ID of that STIG and say this was a failed check from the 2022 server. And then your responsibilities as a CSP is to then take those failed checks and treat them like you would your other vulnerability scan findings, and either tie them to an operational requirement or identify it as a false positive and have those documented in a deviation request form. So from an ideal testing scenario, what we need from you as a CSP is first and foremost, we need to have the inventory well ahead of the assessment, right? That way we can identify all the components that will or will not have existing DISA-STIGs or CIS level 2 benchmarks. That way, when we come in and we're reviewing your benchmarks, because we're going to ask for all benchmarks for all components, we can do a quick 1-to-1 ratio and validate where you may or may not be meeting the requirements. The second thing here is the full details. We need full details in those benchmarks. Having a summary findings is not going to help anyone in the situation. We need to be able to identify what is the issue, what hosts were impacted, what, if any, if there was a NIST finding, we can identify those and put those into the report correctly. And then the last part here is that any deviations, again, like I said, any deviations tied directly to a NIST control will be added to the risk exposure table, and then expect there to be findings if you're not implementing STIGs or level 2 CIS benchmarks. All right, I know that was a lot to handle, but I'm gonna just roll through, and for sake of time, just gonna go into the SR control family. So this was a new introduction of a control family, but I always like to point out that while it may not have been fully supply chain risk management, there were other controls that we were doing in Rev 4 that sort of touched on the premises of supply chain risk assessment, right? We had SA4 and SA9, and in those controls it said, develop contracts with your vendors, and also evaluate and risk review your external services. So that portion of supply chain was happening there. In MA6, that is getting your vendors to provide you timely maintenance and support for like if something fails in your system, that you can get a component within time. Usually that all got wrapped up into MSAs, but the idea and intention there is that you're providing risk compensation for your supply chain. And then of course we have CM53, which was for digitally signed software, so that would help with counterfeiting. And then PS7 was evaluation of your third-party vendors. So while those controls touched on the premise of SR, now we have a full control family that's focused on this as the environment, or as the industry shifts on the idea of supply chain risk management. So in the ideal scenario, we would want to make sure that we're seeing that some sort of internal risk assessment was done on yourselves to identify areas that need more scrutiny in your supply chain. This could be, for instance, if you're in a colo, you may need to make sure there's a chain of custody for components when they're brought into the data centers, right? That's just one example of where you might identify controls need to be in place for your supply chain. Another thing that we're going to look for is supply chain risk analysis. We're going to look for that a risk review was performed for all vendors and components in the system. It no longer only applies to high risk external services. That was the old way of looking at it. Now we should be evaluating everything and anything that touches our system. So things we're going to look at is that questions and risk levels from NIST 800-161 are being leveraged. Those will help us build a baseline that you are truly going through the process of identifying areas of risk and setting your system up in a way to reduce the risk that a supply chain failure happens. And the other thing is that you're collecting all the types of compliance reports that you can from a vendor to get a full scope of what that system is about. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, I did put in this requirement that is in the language of the FedRAMP SR6. And in bold, I put in there where it says they want to see alignment with NIST Special Publication 800-171 or commensurate security and compliance framework. So one thing to point out here is that caveat there is potentially misleading. There are very few standards or frameworks out there that could be commensurate with NIST 800-171. It's its own its own certification through CMMC, which is it's still being finalized, but that is where CMMC is going to take over, is performing and evaluating DoD vendors to a certain standard, right? At the time, a SOC assessment does not truly align itself with a 171 assessment. Same thing with ISO. There isn't truly a ISO certification out there that will align directly with a NIST 800-171. So from our perspective, and hopefully from your perspective as well, is that you'll want to be reaching out to your vendors and seeing if they have performed a self-assessment of 171, or if they have received a 171 gap analysis or something in the same ballpark of 171 to truly to meet this standard. One other thing I just wanted to point out too is while I am saying that SOC and ISO are not direct commensurate security and compliance frameworks, it does not mean that you cannot receive those and get some sort of supplemental reports on top of their already existing SOC and ISOs that could meet the needs, right? It's just really up to you guys to do that due diligence to see that a vendor is truly meeting the 171. Then the final bullet point here is evidence for anti-counterfeit training. So really that's just going to be sort of along the same lane as when a insider threat training was reviewed or social engineering was reviewed. It's just seeing evidence that some form of training is being provided to your team to identify, a fake licensed Windows product, or other key indicators of counterfeit material. If say you're following the digital signature requirements, if you're getting failed digital signature responses, that you're not just installing software without getting that fully vetted. Those are just some ideas of what you can do in that area. All right, and then the last slide here. So just the last two here, I did already cover CA7, but just to reiterate, we expect to see that meeting invites include all agencies and that invites were extended. So there's not going to be a requirement that everyone attends every meeting, right? That's just unrealistic. Your federal agencies, the people that you are sending this out to, they may or may not be on the call, or they may just not be available at the certain times that you were able to meet. The intention is that you as a CSP have reached out to your agencies, you gave them the time that you have available, and you're producing an agenda that you can then share with them if you need to after the call, if that's what they prefer. Really, that's what the intention here of CA7 is, that everyone involved with your system has the ability to voice their opinion on where things are going. And then RA 511, from our perspective, we're just going to test that you truly have a public forum. I should be able to just be given a URL and type that in. I can see where I could report a vulnerability if I wanted to. That's really the true intent of this control. The other thing is that we'll want to see on the back end that you are actually doing something with reported vulnerabilities, right? We don't want to see that they're just going into an S3 bucket that no one answers, right? That's not the intent here. The intent is to allow you all to get a almost like a free penetration testing done by the public, identifying vulnerabilities for your system and letting you have the time to evaluate and address these issues. The other thing is that we'd want to see some form of banner or a public policy that you guys have created that provides clear language that authorizes that good faith research and a disclosure of vulnerabilities to the organization. A key note here for RA 511, while the intent of the control, and this is in the NIST guidance below, or in the actual control itself, while the intent of a public disclosure forum is to really allow that openness from between the public and you can still have a requirement in there that a non-disclosure of, say, 30 days or 60 days, however you guys associate it, that whoever is reporting that vulnerability gives you a chance to address the vulnerability. So that way, when it does get reported publicly, you've had a time to fix it so that there's not a mad rush to try and hack your systems, right? It's a balancing act here for RA 511, but the intent that we want to see is, again, it's a truly public forum. It shouldn't be behind a paywall, shouldn't be behind some two-factor authentication where I'd have to get passwords from you all. It should be open so that I could report something to you all, and I see the language clear in front of me as to what I am to do once I report a finding to you. So that's what we're looking there. All right. And I know I've just said a lot. So just one thing I want to say is from our interpretation of these controls, it's coming from PMO feedback from the open forum calls and the FAQ section. And once you get the slide deck, you can easily go to fedramp.gov/FAQs. This will let you know that's where all the Rev 5 language is going to be posted at this time. They are doing monthly open calls, but I can't remember what the next one is. But truly just go to the FAQs, and that's where you should see a lot of your answers for your questions. It's been very helpful, not only from a 3PO perspective, but a lot of CSPs. I just direct them there because 9 times out of 10, their questions are there. The other thing is that if you have any other questions specifically about FedRAMP, getting started in FedRAMP, or doing any of the transitions for Rev 5, you can just definitely reach out to us, Schellman, using the link in the documentation that is provided. Okay, I know I took up a lot of time there, but I'll hand it off to you, AJ.
Thanks, Doug. I wanted to touch on a couple of big things that Doug had talked about, control-wise, and how we want to, from an advisory perspective, handle it. One of the controls is SI 418. That's talking about the analyzation of traffic and covert exfiltration. The simple answer, as Doug said, is DLP, 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 DLP. Implement that, have that at all locations possible, so you provide the security to address kind of the minimum requirement. What we also recommend is defense in depth, best practices. It's not just implementing DLP, it's having your AV malware and HID solution as tight as possible, with as many configurations implemented, modules implementation, and then taking all of those logs, all of those alerts, plugging that into your SIEM, and having your SIEM then configured to do deep lying alerting. Out of the box and based on FedRAMP parameters, there's a lot of alerts we have to either implement or leverage that come from our SIEM provider. We recommend going above and beyond, taking those edge cases and creating custom alerts for those, making sure those trigger and report to the right personnel. Again, something that may not be something we want to talk about today from a deep lying communication perspective. It's something we want to create alerts for. That defense in depth is the way we address this from the best security hygiene perspective. So again, going above and beyond as much as possible. Some of the SR controls, the two things we also want to talk about is documentation and process. So understanding what our processes are end to end, from a procurement perspective, from a security and vendor management perspective, making sure all of our legal pieces are covered, the ISAs are included, then making sure all of our various stakeholders approve all of those along each one of those phases, and then documenting that very accurately, making sure we understand exactly what the role responsibility of every team or every person along that path is. The big thing with SR is also working with your IaaS vendors. If you are a SaaS provider, you have a lot of inheritance you need to do with your IaaS and your PaaS providers. So it's reaching out to them over the next month or over the next few months as you work on your Rev 5 transition to make sure you get as much information on what they're able to provide. If there's any overlaps or if anything new that you guys need to implement to address some of those new SR requirements, or make sure you reach out to your IaaS vendors to make sure they have the right information provided to you so you guys can leverage and review that. From our understanding, there should be another iteration of information from IaaS providers over the next month. So whenever that does come out, make sure we review that. On the encryption piece, I always focus on 3 letters, and they are ALL. The word all is called out for encryption for SC8 all the way up to SC28. So we want to make sure we erase for all locations for encryption at rest, not just databases. We're talking about S3 buckets. We're talking about any other location where data may reside. We want to make sure the encryption is enabled, and that encryption is FIPS 140-2 validated. Talking about data in transit, their traffic. We want to make sure we see the FIPS mode enablements in TLS 1.2 for all communication between service to service, VPC to VPC, VLAN to VLAN. Wherever we have traffic flowing, we want to make sure we implement the right security for data in transit. Again, I'm going to stick with those 3 letters again, ALL. At all locations that we have the ability to implement security, we want to implement security. The last thing I'll kind of cover is the criticality analysis pieces. For a lot of the things that Doug had talked about from an inventory perspective, we have requirements now to go through and for all of our assets in the inventory, define the criticality. Something that is a public facing asset will need to have enhanced monitoring, or we would recommend enhanced monitoring because we know that's a greater attack or threat vector for malicious actors than something that's sitting behind 3 different layers of firewalls and MFA. So understanding what our assets are, where the vulnerable points are, and applying those security controls at a greater level is very important from a general hygiene perspective. So what we also want to do is cover a couple of the controls in depth that go above and beyond what we have talked about. One of the themes we're going to call out today in this section is the fact that FedRAMP Rev 5 is in place, but we also have other requirements that come outside of Rev 5 that are very important. The big thing we'll call out is the White House memo, M2131, that has a lot of requirements and updates for the investigation, remediation capabilities related to cybersecurity incidents. There's also M2209 that has another bit of updated requirements. Each one of those things that may not be directly called out in a FedRAMP baseline, a FedRAMP control, or a FedRAMP parameter is something we have to take into account as we re-architecture, as we update controls and build out new processes and update our documentation. Off the top of my head, when we talk about audit log storage, M2131 will change audit log storage requirements. We'll have new requirements on how we handle that, how we report. All of those things are things we need to analyze and make sure we include. What we're going to kind of talk about is, for the purposes of today, is AC44. The newer controls that talks about, or updates that talks about, service providers must support agency requirements for those, preventing encrypted information on the CSP data flows and making sure we're decrypting the information at the right locations, re-encrypting it at the right locations, and then we're blocking the flow of any encrypted information where it needs to go, and then terminating appropriately and passing that encryption appropriately. So again, if we've got data flowing in from an external service or resource, we want to make sure that data is encrypted. Once that data passes into the boundary, it needs to be decrypted at the appropriate location, for instance, a load balancer. Once that information is decrypted inside the boundary, we want to make sure we re-encrypt that. And again, going back to that data in transit encryption, having that encrypted with every other location it traverses inside the boundary. So the big thing we want to talk about for this, again, is just making sure we've got end-to-end security in place. We're auditing against that end-to-end security flow, and we're making sure it's passing through the right locations for encryption and decryption. The next one we're going to talk about is AC68. So again, one of those controls that we don't really look at as much. And this is talking about software execution and execution of certain software at higher privileges. This is very important from a role-based access control perspective, from a separation of duties perspective, calling out that if I need to run security software, I should have the appropriate privileges to run that security software. If I need to do write activities, I should be an administrator. I shouldn't have general administrative activity or lower level activity. Even from an endpoint perspective, I need to have the privilege rights, the administrator rights to execute any sort of software. So limiting any sort of internal attack vectors or threat vectors that may come into place from a human perspective. Because at the end of the day, from a technology we can implement, humanly, we want to make sure we cover that or have compensating controls in place. The next two we're going to talk about are those 2 big controls. I know Doug had covered some of these, but we want to make sure we cover this in depth as well. The first big control we're going to talk about is CIA82. CIA82 is the red teaming exercise. This has been a huge source of questions, clarifications, validations that have been asked across the industry, from the 3 PAOs to the advisors, CSPs, all the way across the board. What we want to talk about today is the general recommendations and where we stand today. Having talked with our 3 PAO partners, having talked with other advisory firms, getting guidance from the PMO, talking to JAB and various other locations, the general guidance we wanted to relay is that the red team exercise is not a small undertaking. What we've been described it as is something above and beyond what we see from the normal pen test activities. So our normal pen test activities have 6 use cases, and that is what we need to prep for, and that it's done in a normal audit by our 3 PALs. This red team exercise needs to go above and beyond that, cover more comprehensive scope and more comprehensive information from a security and pen testing perspective. The other 2 big pieces of guidance we've been given is one, that this does not have a requirement of who it needs to be completed by, whether that's a 3 PAL or completed internally. The general recommendation we have from our perspective is to always run this by a 3 PAL. If you're running this red team test internally, please run your scope by your third-party assessment organization. Have them validate or approve that to make sure it requires what they understand and what the PMO is letting them know they have to test or validate against. Our other recommendation, though, is more important, is to say, hey, work with your third-party assessment organization. Incorporate that red team exercise into your annual audit. It's a way to kind of hit 2 birds with 1 stone. So you're knocking out your red team activities and your annual pen test requirements. So it's 2 requirements done at the same time, working with your third-party assessment organization. And it'll take some of the burden lift off of internal resources to have that scheduling completed above and beyond what you normally do on an annual perspective. The next one we're going to talk about is CM6. I know Doug had touched upon this and said, you know what, this is not an easy implementation. We're going to reiterate that and kind of go even more so and say, hey, this is not an easy control. This is probably one of the toughest controls we've come up with as a part of the Rep 4 to Rep 5 transition. This has the highest level of effort because this affects almost every potential asset in your environment. Starting out from an OS perspective, if we're running a CIS level 1 benchmark, we'll have X number of implementations or configurations that have to be done. On a general average, a DISA-STIG may have a few lesser in number, but those configurations are much more stringent. They're much more restrictive. So this is important for us to implement into our AMIs, into our gold images, make sure we're validating that. This has downstream effects of anything running on that OS needs to have testing done as a part of our SDLC processes to make sure we're understanding, does this application, does this feature function on a hardened environment, something that's hardened above and beyond what we did at CIS level 1, now on a DISA-STIG. This also changes our requirements for RA5, where we now have to update our compliance scans. Instead of running a compliance scan against CIS level 1, we have the right policies enabled on those scans to address DISA-STIGs. Doug had mentioned earlier as well, we want to make sure we get the full output. Most of the vulnerability scanners you use will give you that very nice bar graph of green, yellow, and red. We want to make sure we go through and analyze each one of those configurations on the yellow and red, so we understand, again, what do we need to put in a data request? What do we put in a POEM? And what do we run by our agency or the JAB to have them approve on that monthly basis as a part of that meeting that needs to occur? So again, this control is a very simple wording control saying CIS level 1 to DISA-STIG, but the implementation affects various teams, various resources, and has a huge level of effort across the board. Jumping into the controls, and I'll kind of run through these since we're coming on time. SI 12.1 is talking about maintaining availability of cryptographic keys when we have the potential loss. And the big recommendation here is the escrow of encryption keys. An encryption key can be lost in various ways. Something even as simple as a forgotten passphrase will lead to having that cryptographic key be lost and then causing major functionality issues. So having the capability of implementing the escrowing of encryption keys is a very important thing working on. We can leverage our native IaaS provider solutions and update some of our processes related to that. On SC24, we relate this a lot to making sure we do our backups appropriately, tying this to our CP controls, making sure when we're doing failovers, we're doing them securely. We've got the right backups in place, and we're able to define what needs to fail over, where it needs to fail over, and how we can do our reconstitutions. SI 410, we're talking about is, again, encryption in traffic to protect confidentiality across the board. Again, we're going to reiterate this based on another earlier piece, is the fact that all internal traffic needs to be encrypted. All traffic coming external to internal needs to be encrypted. All traffic going internal to external needs to be encrypted. And we need to make sure we validate that for every part of the data flow. As we're creating or updating our boundary diagrams, and we validate each one of these, we want to make sure we update and call out where TLS is, where FIPS mode is enabled, and where those pieces aren't. So we have full clarity and transparency with our third-party assessment organizations and our agency sponsors or the JAG. The last one we're going to talk about, again, is cryptography. Cryptography, encryption is something we harp upon as things that are very important for us because we consider them those showstopper controls. So for us, for SI 715 is, as we're implementing software from our components, making sure we have the right cryptographic mechanisms in place. This is both a technology control, a process control, and a procurement control as we're appropriately getting the right tools and technology in place. So jumping into where we stand on the revision and the transition phases. As we stand today on September 6th, we've gone through the first deliverables for the FedRAMP PMO, which was the Rev 4 to Rev 5 gap analysis, the Rev 4 to Rev 5 transition plan, and the updated CIS CRM workbooks. All of those should have been uploaded to OMB Max as of the end of day on September 1st. So what we're now planning for is all of the other CSPs that need to do work moving forward. If you're in the initiation phase where you're just getting into implementing your controls, we want to understand that Rev 5 needs to be implemented. If you're in the initial phase of just coming up with a project plan, you need to understand that Rev 5 needs to be implemented. And then the last one is, as you are a FedRAMP authorized service, you need to make sure you created that project plan. You have your timelines organized to set up all those updated controls, and you've worked with your third-party assessment organization to make sure they understand what controls are going to change, what your updates are going to be, and make sure you have your next audit scheduled according to the Rev 5 parameters. There will be minor contractual things you'll have to work out with your third-party assessment organization, scope changes, things of that nature. We recommend you reach out and get that completed as early as possible to make sure you don't have any last minute or backloaded issues. Kind of running through some of the big things, we already know that we have new control families. We know we have a full new package of new documents that need to be implemented. There are new SSP templates. There's new templates for attachments. We have net new attachments. All of those are very important for us to work on as we redocument or update our entire documentation package to hit the Rev 5 requirements. We've already talked through DISA-STIG requirements, red team exercises, updates in technology, including DLP and privacy requirements. I'll kind of jump through these and we'll say some of the big things we wanted to include in this presentation is working with Azure, the Azure security team. We've worked through and defined for Azure resources some of the controls that can apply or help with implementation. So again, if we're using something like an Azure Sentinel or Microsoft Sentinel has a lot of controls that can provide coverage for, not just from an auditing perspective, but there are enhancements or parts of AU controls that we've listed out here that'll be given out as part of this presentation that say, hey, if you leverage Sentinel, you can address some of these controls. And we've covered this for the 6 major control families per our understanding, which are AC, AU, CM, SC, SI. We'll go ahead and kind of hit the closing remarks. We want to say we very much appreciate you guys all hopping on this webinar, listening in. And Doug, I'll hand it over to you for a quick remark from your end.
Yes, again, thanks, AJ, and thank you all for joining. I know that was a lot of material that we went through. Ideally, I wish we had more time to continue to go through things. But again, thank you all for joining.
Perfect. We kind of want to end with the quick kind of pitch of, at the end of the day, we're all in the FedRAMP space to make sure our CSPs succeed. Whether you're an advisory firm like Quzara, whether you're a third-party assessment organization like Schellman, or you're overarching supporter of Carahsoft who provides services on a lot of different ways. We're all here to work together to make sure CSPs succeed. So we at Quzara and Carahsoft provide a lot of various functionalities that are included in here. As a part of this deck, we'll give you guys some contact information. It'll go out with follow-up emails as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Quzara for any sort of advisory services, or Carahsoft for any of their services, or especially Schellman as a partner here for any of their third-party assessment organization processes. So again, thank you guys very much, and Carahsoft will hand it over to you guys.
Thanks again, AJ and Doug, for presenting. Thank you to everyone as well for joining us today. We hope that you found this informative and helpful for you and your organization.